What's up guys, welcome to a new SAP S/4HANA Cloud Knowledge snippet. In today's snippet we will be staying on the topic of advanced variant configuration, and we'll look at the possibilities that exist for you to improve and tailor the UI to your heart's content, and thus provide your sales order entry people for a better user experience and very likely as well efficiencies within their workflow. So without further ado, let's look at a sales order to kind of set the context of what it is that we're trying to do, what it is that we're trying to solve for. And up until 1808, whenever you created a sales order, as soon as you entered a configurable material in the sales order, you would be directly taken to a screen similar to this one, where the person entering the sales order would be invited to evaluate the characteristics of the product that they were selling and trying to configure. So in this case, we're selling a MacBook Pro, and we can see that we have a certain number of options that I can actually influence and play with by selecting a different value than the one that is presented. However, we can also see that there are a certain number of characteristics which are not open for input, which means that I do not have any influence on directly putting information in these particular characteristics. It means that these characteristics are filled based on choices that I make in the other characteristics, where I can actually influence the value that they hold. And from a workflow point of view, this is something that could be quite distracting. Now in this screen here, we don't have that many characteristics, but if you picture momentarily a more complex product that would have many different options that can be configured. So just imagine if you had, for example, say as little as 50 characteristics that you could evaluate, and then potentially another 50 that were purely used for storing intermediate calculation results or temporary information that is used either in the process downstream, for example in manufacturing, or simply to hold temporary information. So having all of these characteristics in the one screen can be somewhat a bit distracting and possibly even daunting for a person just starting out, because they might always be wondering, should I be putting something in this particular field? Why is it that the system is not letting me do it? So what you want to do is you want to try and take as much of the distraction away from your sales order entry people, so that they can really just focus on their work, which is to evaluate those characteristics, get the sales order done, and move on to the next one. And up until 1808, what you would have been confronted with is something like this, where you only have one tab called default group, and all of the characteristics were without any real rhyme or reason just presented in that screen. Well, actually, the way in which they are ordered on the screen was dependent on the order in which they had been added in the class of the configurable material that you are trying to configure. So thankfully with 1808 we have this new feature that came out, which allows you to create your own tabs, your own characteristic groupings, which I think is going to dramatically improve the productivity of the sales order entry person, because as I said, it allows them to just really hone in on what their job is, to focus on that, evaluate the characteristics, get that sales order in, and move on to the next one. And the example that you could, or the use case that you might want to have to illustrate these different characteristics group is that, well, in its simplest form, such as the one that we'll be using today, it is that there are certain characteristics like these ones here where the person entering the order has got no influence over. So what I want to do is I want to hide all of those characteristics out of sight so that they do not perturb the sales order entry process. I don't want the sales order entry person to have any kind of doubts about, is the information right or not, as long as I've correctly set up my configurable materials and the configuration status is released. That is a sales order that should be good to go and be saved. So as I said, the simplest use case is that I just want to take out of sight all of those characteristics over which I don't want the person to have any sight, or simply because there is no added value in them actually seeing them, because they don't need to enter a value in those characteristics. The other use case is that potentially you might, especially if you're selling somewhat complex products and that are made up of many characteristics, you might, for example, want to have a tab where you can configure, for example, the mechanical aspects of the product. You could have another tab where you might be wanting to configure the electrical aspects of the product. You might also have another tab where you might want to configure things that deal with shipping, localization information. So it really is up to you how you want to group and present those characteristics to your users. So let's dive in and see how we can achieve that. So as I said, this is a new feature that came in with the 1808 release of SAP S/4HANA Cloud, and these features are concentrated in this app called Manage Characteristics Groups. And if you go into it, at the moment we don't have any one defined in our system, but if you had any, obviously then you would see them appear here. You can also, from this particular app, create new ones or delete existing ones if you so wished to do so. Another way of maintaining those is directly in the variant configuration modeling environment. So let's go and look at that. And we'll again be using our trusted PRE MB Pro material. I don't need to enter a plant or a bomb application, as I'm not planning on doing any kind of bomb explosions or tests. And let's dive right in. The other place where you can assign and maintain those characteristics groups is directly in the VC modeling environment in the configuration profile of your configurable material. And you can see here that associated with the configuration profile in the right pane, we have a tab called User Interface. And if I click on this button, it'll take me to the same UI as the Manage Characteristics Groups app. The other way that you can attain the very same functionality is by right-clicking on the configuration profile. We have a contextual menu, and you can pick Assign Characteristics Groups. So let's go to that, and that will launch the app Manage Characteristics Groups. And because I've gone from my configuration profile, the system, as you can see here, he's already kind of giving me that context that I am in the PRE MB Pro configuration profile. So let's go ahead and create a group. And I will indicate here, for example, PREMB Pro. Now that will be the technical name of my characteristic group. That is not the name that will be presented to me in the sales order. So that's just technical. The next thing that we want to do is we want to assign the characteristics. In other words, which are the characteristics of my product that I want to move in this tab called PRE MB Pro. All the ones that are not found to be assigned to a specific characteristics groups will simply remain in the default group at runtime. So now all of my characteristics have been named PRE MB Pro something. So I'm just going to say, okay, I'm looking for PRE MB Pro characteristics. Sorry, put a wildcard star. And we have all of the PRE MB Pro starting characteristics that are presented. And the ones that I want to have on the screen presented to the user will be the processor, will be the storage, will be the graphics, and also the software. All of the other ones, I don't really want him to see them in the tab that I'm creating. So let's go for processor, let's go for storage, let's go for graphics, and let me just double check. So we had PRE MB Pro software. Now these are the only characteristics that I want to have, but bear in mind that you can just keep coming back to assigning more characteristics, because especially if you're going to have quite a few of those, it could be that you're not going to be able to maintain all of them in one breath. Now, another tip that I can give you is that, especially if you are going to be adding, a numerous amount of characteristics, then I would suggest that what you do is you kind of first look at all the characteristics that you'll be wanting to add in a particular tab. And what you should also do is order them, for example, in a piece of software like Excel, or it could even be a notepad, doesn't really matter. But what I would recommend is that when you add those characteristics to your characteristics group, is that you start from the bottom, i.e. what is the last characteristic that you want that person to see, and then work your way up. Because you'll find that as you click on assign characteristics, the more characteristics you have, they're all going to be pushed down towards the bottom. So that's why I'm saying start with the bottom and work your way up. The other tip that I can give you is, in the sorting order, you might be tempted to say, well, okay, so this will be characteristic number 1, this will be number 2, number 3, and number 4. I would, however, recommend that you give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. And what I mean by that is, for example, the processor, I want that to be in the first position, but I'm going to give that the order number 10. Then I'm going to give the storage the 20, because I want that to be in the second position. The graphics card is going to be 30, and the additional software is going to be 40. Now, the reason why I've numbered these 10, 20, 30, 40 is because nothing is set in stone, right? So we live in a fast-changing world, and it could be that tomorrow I'm going to be adding a couple of additional configuration options that I want to kind of insert between processor and graphics card, for example. Now, if I had numbered these 1, 2, 3, 4, then I guess it's not going to be a huge amount of work for me to renumber those into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, for example. But if you had a lot of characteristics, then obviously if the increment is in units, it's going to be very tedious, painful for you to update the order. So that's why I'm using 10, 20, 30, 40. I'm using tens in increments, because if all of a sudden I want to add a new characteristic into my characteristics group, so for example, let's go for country cell. So I'm just going to say, okay, I'm looking for my characteristic called country something, which is country cell. So by default, you see it's going to have the value 0, so it's going to be at the top. But I want that to be somewhere between graphics card and additional software, so I have some space to move around here. So I'm just going to say 35, and that characteristic then gets inserted between graphic card and additional software. So again, just note that if I had numbered these 1, 2, 3, 4, I would have had to make a change to, for example, additional software and name that 5, so that I could then put the countries in the number that was previously occupied by additional software. So just bear in mind that, and if you need to do 50 increments or hundreds increments, then, do whatever works for you. But as I said, give yourself a little bit of wiggle room so that any updates are not going to be too tedious for you. So I'm just going to, then the next thing that I've done now that I've added those characteristics is I'm going to add an English description to this characteristics group. So this is what the person will actually see when they come to configure the sales order. So I'm just going to call this MacBook Pro options. And now I'm going to save that. And we come back to this main screen here. And the next thing that I need to do is, my group has been created, if you like. I need to assign it to the configuration profile of my material. So I'm just going to say assign the group. I'm going to select it. I'm going to say OK. And again, you can see here that I've got a sort order, because I could have one characteristic group that would have been, for example, the mechanical aspects of the product. I could have another group that could be the electrical aspects of the product. So you kind of get the picture that I could have multiple characteristic groups. And again, I want to define the order in which these groups or tabs are going to appear. I'm only going to have this one here, but I'll still give it the number 10, and I'll just save this. So we've done a characteristics group, we've defined the characteristics that are part of the group, we've given it a name, and we've assigned it to the configuration profile of our material. And of course, what you can do is, if you ever need to maintain this characteristics group, you don't have to go to the VC modeling environment to further maintain it or change it or even create it if you want. You could also go directly to the Manage Characteristic Group app. And again, here you can find your grouping that you can further change or delete as you need to do it. Okay, so now that I've added the or saved this assignment of characteristics group to my configurable material or to his configuration profile, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to test it and see what that looks like. So I'm just going to get out of this particular sales order, and I'm going to go back in and create a new one. And what should happen now is that hopefully we'll see that there is a new tab or grouping called MacBook Pro Options that shows those characteristics that I had selected, nicely defined in the order that I had put them in my characteristics grouping. Okay, let's go PREMB Pro, quantity of 1. We go into the configuration screen. And there you go. Already here we can see that we have this tab, MacBook Pro Options, which just presents those characteristics that I want the sales order entry person to see and look at and evaluate if they need to. All of the other characteristics are still there, of course, but they stay nicely tucked away out of sight in the default group. But the person can still go to the default group if he wants to maybe check that a particular calculation or other characteristic has been correctly evaluated. Another tip that I'll quickly show you is, of course, when you do the configuration, the way you do the configuration is from the top to the right and down. So you would do this characteristic first, then this one, then this one. And if you are somewhat nostalgic of the way it used to be done in the ECC or using the old LOVC component, and you'd rather have a top-down workflow, then what you can do is you can click on this particular button here in the top right. And what you can do is you can play with the size of the panes so that you essentially see all of the characteristics one right after the other. So again, it really is up to you, depending on your workflow, if you want to see them all from left to right, top to bottom, or just from top to bottom, and then you can evaluate the characteristics to suit the way of your workflow. Last thing that I'll also show you is the ability that you can here see both the technical and the language dependent description of the characteristics and values. So in this case, I've chosen to look at both, which is I want to see both the English, so the language dependent name of my characteristics and values, but you could also play around and say, for example, I just want to see the descriptions. I'm not really bothered. I don't care. I don't want to know what they're called technically. I just want to do my job. So you just see the English version of those characteristics. So there you go. This was a neat new feature that was introduced with the 1808 release of SAP S/4HANA Cloud, and hopefully will dramatically improve the user experience of the sales order entry person. So I hope you enjoyed this S/4HANA Cloud Knowledge snippet. Stay tuned, like our content, share, subscribe for more. See you soon.